At my husband's funeral, my son whispered, "We're selling everything." The lawyer smiled, then pulled out the updated $51.00 will with my signature. As I dressed that morning, Elise, my granddaughter, peeked into the room. She was shy, only 12, clutching her school bag. "Grandma, it's cold," she whispered. I took the woolen scarf I had knitted months ago and wrapped it gently around her neck. She blushed, murmuring a soft "thank you" before running off. I smiled, not knowing then how much that small moment would return to me. The church smelled faintly of lilies and old wood, the kind of smell that clings to grief and memory. The casket was closed, polished mahogany with brass handles, my husband's name engraved in small gold letters. I sat in the front row, my black dress plain and without lace, my hands folded around a worn handkerchief I had carried for decades. At 76, my back bent slightly, but I sat as tall as I could. I was not there to collapse. I was there to say goodbye to the man I had loved since I was a girl. The choir hummed softly, the organ filled the silence with notes heavy as stone, and still I felt the eyes of my own family shift toward me like daggers in the dark. Owen leaned down, his hand gently squeezing my shoulder. "Don't worry, Mother," he whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. "We'll take care of everything from now on. You don't need to burden yourself." What I did not know until later was that Owen had been drowning in private debts for years. Reckless loans, failed investments, hidden contracts. My husband had quietly covered for him more than once. Now, with his father gone, Owen's desperation spilled out like blood from an old wound. The funeral was not the cause, it was only the excuse. Victoria added with a practiced smile for the mourners, "Yes, Mama Bellezza, you should rest. Leave all the decisions to Owen, he's the head of the family now." Their voices were sweet as honey, but I caught the glint in their eyes, the kind of sweetness that hides venom. Her laughter was sharp, a dagger disguised as music. Then she raised her finger, pointing it straight at me in front of the mourners. "Keep your mouth shut if you know what is good for you. Otherwise, get out of this house. And do not ever dream of seeing the children again." The air thickened. I looked at the faces around me. My relatives, my neighbors, the people who came to honor my husband. Not one spoke. Not one came to my defense. They turned their eyes downward, into their laps, into the hymnals, anywhere but into mine. It was easier to pretend they did not hear. It was easier to let silence become complicity. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the storm rising quietly inside me. I pressed my knuckles together to stop the shaking. My husband lay not 10 feet from me, and already the wolves were circling. My son's voice, cold and greedy, still echoed in my mind. "We're selling everything, as if my life were a ledger, and my years nothing more than numbers he could erase." The priest's voice droned on, but I barely heard him. I remembered the mornings I woke before dawn to make Owen's breakfast. The nights I stayed up sewing clothes so he would not be mocked at school. The way I had sold my own mother's jewelry to pay for his college textbooks. He was standing there in a suit I had helped choose when he was 18, smirking at me as if I were already dead. Victoria shifted beside him, her heels clicking against the wooden floor, her perfume sweet but suffocating. She leaned closer, her words meant to cut. "You are nothing but a shadow in this family. Do not mistake tolerance for love. You were useful when you cooked and cleaned. Now you are just in the way." She squeezed Owen's arm and smiled, a smile practiced for charity luncheons and photographs, but her eyes glinted with venom. I sat motionless, my face calm. That was always my way. They thought silence meant weakness. They never understood that silence could also mean memory. Every word they spat at me, every insult, every betrayal, I stored them like stones in a riverbed. Heavy, cold, waiting for the day the current would change, the choir began another hymn. I mouthed the words, though my throat was dry. Around me, people dabbed their eyes with tissues, murmured prayers, and whispered about how tragic it was. But tragedy is not just death. Tragedy is being alive while your own blood marks you as disposable. Owen leaned back again, this time without lowering his voice enough. "Peter, this. We will meet with the lawyer. Everything will transfer quickly. Mother has no say. She is just a signature, and we can get that if we need to." His eyes were flat, calculating. He did not see me as a mother. He saw me as an obstacle, a piece of paper standing between him and fortune. I felt the words burn into me, but I refused to flinch. I kept my hands folded, my head high. Inside, though, something shifted. A cord that had tied me to patience and silence snapped. They believed they had cornered me, that I would go quietly, humiliated, stripped of dignity. They did not know the woman they had tried so hard to erase. The hymn ended, the organ's echo fading into silence. The priest invited family to speak, but Owen shook his head, and Victoria waved him off, as if their grief were too heavy. Yet I saw no grief in them, only hunger, only greed. I stood slowly, surprising even myself. My knees ached, but I straightened my back and walked to the coffin. I laid my hand on the polished wood, whispering a farewell no one else could hear. My husband had trusted me. He had known me, and though the world tried to diminish me, his faith in me still lived in the documents they had not yet seen, in the truth waiting beneath the lies. When I turned back, Owen's eyes narrowed, Victoria's lips tightened. They expected me to collapse, to slink away. Instead, I walked past them with calm steps and returned to my seat. I said nothing, because sometimes silence is louder than rage. But in that silence, I made my promise. This humiliation, these words, this day, it would not be forgotten. It would be remembered, carried, and one day it would be returned to them, sharper than the blade they had tried to put into my back. No one defended me that day. No one raised their voice against the cruelty spat in a widow's face. The humiliation pressed down like snow on my shoulders, but I bore it. And I bore something else, too. A secret they had never suspected, a truth they would one day choke on. That day at my husband's funeral, they thought they had broken me. What they did not know was that they had only lit the fire. I remember the years when my hands did not tremble, when they were strong enough to hold blueprints, circuit boards, and soldering irons. In the 1970s, when most women were told to sit quietly in kitchens, I was building something else. Systems that could think, machines that could move without a hand guiding them. Early designs in automation that would later reshape entire industries. My name was never on the patents, of course. I worked in dimly lit labs, in factories thick with grease and metal shavings, while men in pressed suits signed the papers and smiled for photographs. I was the mind in the shadows, and for a while I was content because I believed the work itself mattered more than recognition. But then came my husband Henry. He was not cruel in the way Owen and Victoria are, not openly. He was simply traditional, bound to ideas that men worked and women served. He insisted it was not appropriate for a wife to spend long nights in factories or travel for installation projects. He said, "Bellezza, you should focus on Owen. Children need mothers more than machines need operators." And I gave in. Not because I agreed, but because my heart told me that if I let Owen grow up without me, I might regret it more than losing any career. So I traded my drafting tables for ironing boards, my calculations for recipes, my notebooks of equations for Owen's school reports. He grew up never knowing who I really was. To him, I was simply the woman who knitted scarves, baked pies, and folded his shirts. He thought his father built everything, paid for everything, and carried the family on his shoulders. He never knew the truth, that my investments, the quiet deals I made behind closed doors, the savings I built penny by penny, were the reason he had piano lessons, private tutors, and later, college tuition. And yet, the older he became, the less he saw me. To him, I was just Mom, the background figure, the one who sat around knitting. He once said it so casually that it stung like a blade. "You never worked, Mom. You never really did anything." He said it at dinner, with Victoria nodding beside him, her lips curling as if to seal the insult into permanence. But it was not enough for them to dismiss me. They had to hate me, too. Their hatred grew around Jaden. Jaden Adams was a young man with sharp suits, polished shoes, and the kind of confidence that made people turn their heads when he entered a room. He was a lawyer, yes, but more than that, he was family, though Owen and Victoria never knew it. When I met Jaden again years later, I embraced him as I would my own. But to Owen and Victoria, the sight of me with him was scandal. Victoria was the first to plant the poison. She saw me sitting with Jaden at a cafe, talking softly about old books and legal advice, and she returned home with her sharp tongue sharpened further. Your mother, she told Owen, is embarrassing the family, parading herself around with a young man half her age. People will think she is being conned, or worse, that she is, infatuated. Do you want the children to see their grandmother humiliate herself like this? Owen listened. He always listened to her more than he ever did to me. Soon after, he confronted me, his voice cold and distant, not the voice of a son, but of a man delivering judgment. If you want us to love you again, Mother, you will cut Jaden off. Do you understand? End it, or you will never see the children again. I looked into his eyes and saw nothing of the boy I once raised. There was no kindness, no memory of the bedtime stories I told, the scraped knees I bandaged, the sleepless nights I endured at his side. There was only greed, suspicion, and a hunger for control. Victoria stood behind him, her arms folded, her chin lifted high. She added her venom, as she always did. We will lock the doors forever if you refuse. Do not test me, Bellezza. An old woman like you should know better than to drag scandal into this family. People will laugh, they will sneer, and you will be the reason our name is ruined. I swallowed my words. I wanted to scream that they were blind, that Jaden was not a stranger, not a vulture circling me for scraps of inheritance. He was the boy my husband and I had once found bleeding and broken on the roadside, the survivor of a crash that had taken his parents. He was the child we could not claim publicly, but whom we raised quietly, providing for his education, sheltering him, guiding him. He was family, ours in every way but name. But to protect him, I said nothing. I bore their accusations in silence. My quiet became the shield that hid the truth, and in their eyes that silence made me guilty. Guilty of impropriety, guilty of shame, guilty of being a fool taken advantage of. The cruelest part was the double standard. Owen himself entertained deals with women young enough to be his daughters, laughing about it with his friends, calling it networking. Victoria spent obscene amounts on clothes and jewelry, all the while calling me wasteful in oyster ways if I bought a new book or a skein of yarn. They condemned me for sitting with Jaden in public while their own lives reeked of hypocrisy. Their hatred became a habit. Every time Jaden visited, every time he called, every time he defended me with sharp words in their presence, their contempt deepened. They painted me as senile, blind, desperate for attention. She is losing her mind, Victoria once said at the dinner table. Soon she will give everything to that boy, and we will be left with nothing. I kept silent still, because silence was the only thing protecting Jaden's secret. If they knew the truth, that he was the child my husband and I had saved, they would turn their hatred on him with even more force. They would twist it into betrayal, into proof that I had hidden something from them, that I had chosen another child over Owen, and in many ways that was the root of it. They could not stand the thought of not being the center of my world. So I let them spit their insults, let them slam doors, let them threaten me with exile from my grandchildren's lives. Each word was a knife. But I bore it. I bore it because I knew what they did not, that one day the truth would come like a tide, sweeping away their lies, their greed, their cruelty. Until then, I carried their hatred as I carried everything else, quietly, patiently, and with the knowledge that every injustice, no matter how bitter, would one day find its reckoning. The house was heavy with silence, the kind that follows a funeral like a shadow. People murmured in corners, sipping coffee from delicate china cups, balancing small plates of casseroles and pastries that neighbors had brought. The curtains were drawn, the scent of flowers thick in the air, but it was not grief that suffocated me. It was contempt. I sat in the armchair near the fireplace, my black dress folded neatly around me, my hands resting on my lap. I watched as my family filled the room, as voices rose in small talk, as laughter even crept into the corners. My husband had been buried only hours ago, yet already they treated this house as theirs, a space to claim, a prize to divide. Then Victoria's voice cut through the low hum of conversation, sharp as glass shattering on stone. She stood in the center of the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, her wine glass held high as if she were making a toast. Her lips curled into that familiar smirk, venom dripping from every syllable. "So tell me, Bellezza," she said, her voice deliberately loud enough for every cousin, every aunt, every family friend to hear. "Why don't you just climb into the coffin and lie with him? Wouldn't that be easier for everyone?" The room froze. Forks paused in mid-air. Conversation stopped. A nervous cough came from one corner. Someone shifted uncomfortably on the couch. But no one said a word. They all looked at their hands, at their cups, anywhere but at me. I kept my gaze steady, my lips pressed together. My heart was not pounding. It was too practiced for that. This was not the first insult, nor would it be the last. But the cruelty in her voice, so public, so deliberate, it landed like ice on my skin. Owen sat nearby, his tie loosened, his hand resting lazily on his knee. He did not flinch, did not scold his wife, did not protect his mother. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and said almost casually, "Mother, you should know better. Let us handle things. We will take care of everything. You do not need to involve yourself." His voice carried authority, the tone of a man who believed he owned the room, the future, even me. It was not advice. It was dismissal. I sat still, my hands folded neatly, my face calm. To the room, I must have looked fragile, a widow too broken to respond. Some even shook their heads pityingly, as if to say, "Poor old woman, too weak to defend herself." That was what they wanted to believe. That was what Owen and Victoria counted on. That I would absorb their contempt in silence, as I always had. But in that moment, beneath my stillness, something shifted. A quiet fire kindled in my chest, steady and sharp. My eyes lifted to meet theirs, and though I said nothing, my gaze was not empty. It was the gaze of a woman who had endured, who had sacrificed, who had been erased and underestimated too many times to count. And now it was the gaze of someone who had made a decision. They mistook my silence for weakness, but my silence was choice. My silence was preparation. And when my eyes met Owen's, for a flicker of a second, he shifted in his chair. Perhaps he sensed it, that I was no longer the shadow they thought they could trample. The room exhaled, people returning awkwardly to their plates, to their conversations, pretending not to have heard what Victoria said. The humiliation lingered, hanging over me like a heavy fog. But inside, I was already somewhere else. I was planning. I was remembering every insult, every betrayal, every sneer, and I knew then, with absolute clarity, they would regret ever thinking I was too small to fight back. The door opened with a soft creak, and in walked Jaden Adams, dressed in a dark tailored suit, his presence commanding without effort. The chatter in the room dimmed as eyes turned toward him. He moved with the calm confidence of a man who knew his place in the world, though to the vultures in this house, he was nothing more than prey to be picked apart. He carried a leather briefcase, his expression solemn. "Good evening," he said quietly. "I am here on behalf of the late Mr. Hall to read the updated will." The moment his words settled in the air, Owen shot up from his chair as if struck by fire. His voice was sharp, venom-laced with triumph. "Of course you are. You've been circling like a vulture, waiting for this moment, haven't you?" Jaden paused, brow furrowing slightly, but before he could respond, Victoria was already on her feet, her hand clutched theatrically against her chest. "Oh, it is all too obvious now," she cried, her tone dripping with mock horror. "Do not tell me none of you have seen it? My poor father-in-law dead, and here comes this young man with our mother-in-law, whispering and meeting in secret for years. Is it not plain enough? They were lovers." The room gasped, a ripple of murmurs spreading like wildfire. A cousin set down her glass too quickly, the liquid spilling over her hand. An uncle coughed uncomfortably, shifting in his seat. Victoria pressed on, her eyes gleaming with cruelty. She turned toward me, pointing as though she had finally unmasked a criminal. "You disgust me, Bellezza. Do you think we have not noticed? You meeting him late at night, phone calls you tried to hide, visits that made no sense. You are not mourning your husband. You are celebrating the chance to finally flaunt your boy-toy in front of us." Owen stepped closer to Jaden, his voice low but vicious, dripping with malice meant to poison the room. "Tell me, counselor, how much did she pay you to play along? Or was it not money she offered? Perhaps it was something else, something a widow of her age should be ashamed of even thinking about." The crowd shifted, eyes darting between Jaden and me. Some were horrified, others, hungry for scandal, leaned in as though savoring every accusation. But Victoria was not finished. Her lips curled into a smile so cruel it barely looked human. "You all want to know why Miss Hall died so suddenly? why his health failed so quickly. Because she poisoned him. Yes, she did it so she could run away with this young man, marry him, and take every cent of this estate for herself. Do not be fooled by the black dress and trembling hands. It is all a show! The room erupted into whispers, outrage, confusion. My brother-in-law muttered, "Surely not," while one of the nieces whispered, "It would explain why she spent so much time with him." Victoria seized the moment, her voice growing louder, theatrically appealing to the audience. Look at her. Look at the way she sits there with her head down, pretending to be meek. If she were innocent, would she stay silent? No, she stays quiet because she is guilty. A guilty woman always hides behind her silence. Owen added the final dagger, his face twisted with feigned sorrow as he looked around the room. She betrayed my father. She betrayed this family. And now she thinks she can stand here with her lover beside her and steal what is rightfully ours. He gestured toward Jayden, his fingers stabbing the air like a blade. He is not here as a lawyer. He is here as her accomplice, her partner in crime, and if you cannot see it, then you are blind. Jayden's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. His eyes flicked toward me, searching, waiting, as if he knew I would not yet break my silence. And he was right. I sat perfectly still in the armchair, hands folded, my face unreadable. My silence stretched through the room, not weak but deliberate, like a curtain drawn before a stage. Let them rant, I thought. Let them strip themselves bare in front of everyone. For the first time I noticed how the family looked, not at me but at them. Some eyes were wide with doubt, others narrowed with suspicion. Owen and Victoria were not defending anything. They were clawing, tearing, desperate to make their accusations stick before the truth emerged, and I let them. Every cruel word they flung into the air was another rope they wound around their own necks. Victoria laughed coldly, raising her glass as though to seal her accusations with a toast. So here it is, everyone, our grieving widow, tangled in the arms of a younger man, plotting murder and theft under the cover of family. Tell me, who still dares to believe her hands are clean? Her words hung in the silence, daring someone to defend me. But no one spoke. The weight of their slander thickened the air. Still, I remained quiet. My eyes met Jayden's for only a second, and in that second, I knew he understood. This was not the time for defense. This was the time to watch them reveal the full depth of their cruelty. When the silence broke, it was not with my voice. It was with theirs, accusing, spitting, unraveling themselves in front of every witness in that room. And I knew, as surely as I had ever known anything, that their downfall had just begun. The room was still trembling with the echoes of Owen and Victoria's venom when Jayden finally straightened his shoulders and set his briefcase on the polished oak table. The hush that fell was heavy, uneasy. Everyone leaned forward, as though instinctively aware that something far greater than insults was about to be revealed. Jayden did not raise his voice. He did not defend himself with rage or protest. Instead, he calmly clicked open the brass locks of his case and withdrew a thick folder bound neatly with tabs and seals. His expression was composed, his tone measured, but the steadiness of his hands carried an authority that silenced even Victoria's sharp tongue. "I was asked here today by Mr. Hall himself," Jayden began, his eyes sweeping the room. He wanted his final wishes made clear. And though there are many accusations flying tonight, the truth does not bend to noise. He opened the folder and pulled out the first document, holding it up so that the witnesses could see the notary's seal. "This," he said, "is the updated will of Mr. Hall, signed and dated 3 months before his passing. The total estate, valued at $51 million, has been legally and thoroughly reviewed, and this document leaves no room for interpretation." Owen jumped to his feet, his face red, his voice cracking as he barked. "You liar! That paper is a fraud, a scheme you cooked up with her." He pointed at me with a trembling finger, spittle at the corner of his lips. "She's behind this. She wants to take everything away from me." Jayden did not flinch. He simply laid the will on the table, flipping the page to the signature. Mr. Hall signed this with his full capacity. Witnesses were present, notaries confirmed it, the signatures are verified. He paused, then let the weight of his next words drop into the silence. And Bellezza Hall signed it too, because it was her right as his spouse and co-owner of the estate. Gasps rippled across the room. Some relatives exchanged glances, whispering in disbelief. Victoria's smirk faltered, her grip tightening on her wineglass until it threatened to shatter. But Jayden was not finished. He reached into the folder again and withdrew a second set of papers, older, yellowed with time, but still bearing official stamps. He laid them out one by one, each carefully aligned on the table for all to see. His voice softened, but his words struck like a hammer. "And this," he said, "is the adoption decree, filed 35 years ago. It states clearly, under the seal of the state, that I, Jayden Michael Adams, am the legally adopted son of Bellezza and the late Mr. Hall." The room fell into a stunned silence so thick it was almost physical. Chairs creaked as people shifted, straining to read the papers from where they sat. An audible gasp escaped one of the aunts. A cousin whispered, "Adopted son?" Owen's face drained of color, his rage collapsing into panic. "No," he stammered, shaking his head wildly. No, this isn't true. If I had known. His words tangled in his throat, strangled by the weight of his own cruelty. He had demanded once that I cut Jayden out of my life, that I choose between them, never knowing the truth. I lifted my head then, my voice calm, steady, carrying across the room. "You once told me, Owen, that if I did not cut ties with Jayden, then I was no longer your mother. You threatened to lock your children away from me, to turn me into a ghost at your table." I paused, my gaze meeting his. "I stayed silent, not because you were right, but because I did not want you to feel threatened. I thought if I kept this truth hidden, you might still find kindness in your heart. I thought silence would protect what little family I had left." I let the moment hang, my words falling like stones into the still water of the room. "But silence only fed your contempt. And tonight, Owen, it is you, not I, who cut the bond of blood, not with my secrets, but with your own words." Owen's mouth opened and closed like a drowning man gasping for air. He looked to Victoria for support, but for the first time, even she seemed shaken. Her eyes darted nervously between Jayden and the adoption decree, her arrogance cracking at the edges. Around us, relatives whispered, some glaring openly at Owen and Victoria now. The narrative had shifted. They were no longer victims of a supposed scheme. They were the architects of their own disgrace. Jayden's gaze swept the room one final time. "Mr. Hall entrusted me with this not because I am his lawyer, but because I am his son, and I will see to it that his wishes are honored." I sat back in my chair, my spine straight, my eyes never leaving Owen's. For the first time he looked small. The proud, arrogant son who once dismissed me as weak now stood trembling in the ruins of his own accusations. The silence that followed was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of revelation, of shame settling heavily on the shoulders of those who had sought to destroy me. And in that silence I felt no pity, only the sharp, clean edge of justice. The air in the room grew thicker, charged with the kind of tension that makes every breath feel stolen. Owen stood frozen in place, his jaw trembling with unspoken rage. Victoria shifted beside him, her hand clutching his arm as though to steady him, but her knuckles whitened with panic. Jayden did not allow the silence to soften. Instead, he opened his briefcase once more, his movements precise, deliberate, almost surgical. "There is more," he said, his voice calm, carrying easily over the hush. He pulled out a thin stack of papers, each clipped neatly with official seals and signatures. "Documents your father left with me, not just the will. Evidence he wanted preserved, in case Owen ever betrayed the trust he placed in him." Owen's face twitched, his bravado faltering. "You're bluffing," he spat, but his voice cracked at the edges. Jayden laid the first contract flat on the table, sliding it toward the relatives who crowded closer to see. "This," he explained, tapping the header, "is a loan agreement signed by Owen Hall 5 years ago. A private debt, hidden from his family, secured by collateral he had no right to use, the estate that belonged to both his parents. He forged his father's initials on several of these pages. The lender eventually threatened to expose him, but Mr. Hall quietly paid it off to protect the family's name." Gasps broke out like gunfire around the room. An uncle muttered under his breath, "God Almighty," An aunt raised her hand to her mouth. Another cousin shook her head in disgust. Jaden's eyes moved deliberately to Owen. You gambled away your father's trust. You risked the home you claimed to care about, and you forced your dying father to clean up your mess in silence. Owen's eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for sympathy, but none came. He raised his hands, stammering. It was temporary, business risk. Every man does it. He would have wanted me to, but Jaden was not finished. He reached again into the folder, producing several printed pages. Emails. He lifted the first sheet and began to read aloud, his voice steady, word for word, from Victoria Hall to Cassandra Lane. He looked up briefly, then continued. Sometimes I wonder why I even bother being polite to her. Bellezza should know her place by now. She is old. She is irrelevant. And when Owen and I take everything that's left, she'll finally be where she belongs, on the street. Let her knit scarves in the gutter. That's all she's good for. The words struck the room like lightning. Gasps gave way to outright fury. One cousin stood, glaring at Victoria. How could you write something like that? Another aunt snapped. She took you in, treated you like her own, and this is how you repay her? Victoria's face flushed deep crimson, her composure crumbling. It was just a joke between friends. Nothing more. But Jaden held up another page. From the same account. Dated 2 months ago. When Mr. Hall dies, everything will finally be ours. Bellezza can cry all she wants, but once she's out of the way, we'll sell everything. House, land, heirlooms. She has nothing left to bargain with. An old widow deserves nothing. The room erupted in a chorus of disgust. Words like shameful, vile, and snake hissed through the crowd. Some relatives rose from their chairs, pointing accusing fingers at Owen and Victoria, voices shaking with outrage. The mask Owen had so carefully worn for years, the dutiful son, the loyal husband, shattered before them. He looked smaller now, diminished, cornered. This is slander, he shouted, his voice desperate. You all know me. I have been the one taking care of this family's name. It's business. This is a conspiracy. But the relatives no longer believed him. Their eyes turned cold. One of the uncles, who had always spoken proudly of Owen, now muttered, You're no son of this family. You're a leech. Victoria's desperation broke through in a shriek. You're all blind. Do you not see? This is her doing. That old witch has poisoned all of you against us. She's been plotting this for years. She turned toward me, venom spitting from her eyes. You, yes, you. You've ruined us because you could not stand that Owen was finally in control. You should have died with your husband. The room fell silent at her words, silence colder and sharper than any accusation. Even those who had once tolerated her now stared in horror. I did not move. My hands were folded neatly in my lap, my gaze steady on hers. You showed your own heart, Victoria, I said softly, but the words cut like glass. No one needed me to ruin you. You've done it yourself. Jaden closed the folder, his final words quiet but unyielding. The documents will be filed in court. The fraud, the forgery, the slander, it is all here. The law will decide your punishment. But as of this moment, Owen Hall and Victoria Hall are stripped of all rights to the estate. They will not inherit a single cent. The pronouncement was met with a thunderous silence. Then, slowly, applause began. One relative, then another, and another, until the entire room was filled with the sound, not of joy, but of vindication. Owen collapsed into his chair, his head buried in his hands. Victoria stood trembling, her lips moving soundlessly, her world shattered beyond repair. I sat, unmoved. For once I did not feel small in their presence. I felt the truth settle around me like armor, unbreakable, undeniable. And as the room closed around them, rejecting them, I knew the justice I had waited for was finally beginning. The sound of Victoria's voice cut through the room like jagged glass, shrill and desperate, her carefully painted veneer finally ripped away. She shoved past a cousin who tried to calm her, her face twisted with rage and humiliation. You think this makes you noble? She screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me, her voice cracking. You think because you have money and some papers in a folder that you've won? You're nothing but a bitter old hag, clinging to the scraps of pity. You'll die alone, Bellezza. You'll die in that big empty house with no one left to care, no one to mourn you. Money will not warm your bed. Money will not replace a family that hates you. Gasps rippled across the room. Some of the younger cousins instinctively pulled back, frightened by her fury. Owen tried to grab her arm to calm her, but she tore away from him, nearly stumbling, consumed by her spiral. Her voice cracked into an ugly laugh as she spat out the final dagger. Yes, that's what you'll get. An empty coffin and a name forgotten. Because money cannot buy love. The room trembled with her venom, but instead of shrinking back, I rose slowly from my chair. My black dress whispered against the floor as I stood, the years of silence and endurance now gathering into the marrow of my spine. My voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried with the weight of stone. Family, I said, my eyes fixed squarely on her, then shifting to Owen, is not the people who look at you and see a bank account. Family is not the ones who whisper at their father's funeral about selling everything before the ground has even covered him. Family is not the son who looks at his mother and thinks of property before blood. I paused, my words steady, letting the weight of each syllable settle over the hushed crowd. And family, I continued, my gaze unyielding, is not the daughter-in-law who jokes about selling an old woman for her organs. The room went dead silent. You could feel the air being sucked out of it, as if even the walls leaned in to listen. Victoria froze where she stood, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled onto land. I let my voice sharpen to a blade. Family is not a knife to the back. It is not a chain of insults. It is not a cage of threats. Family is built by love, by loyalty, by memory, and I see none of that in you. Then the final cut, delivered with all the clarity of a lifetime of patience breaking. A family that would sell me for my organs is no family at all. The words struck with such force that several relatives let out audible gasps. An aunt whispered, "God forgive them," shaking her head. Another cousin muttered, "Disgraceful." Heads turned toward Owen and Victoria, not with pity, but with the cold judgment of disgust. Victoria staggered back, her face pale, her mouth trembling. Owen lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The applause that followed was not polite. It was sharp, bitter, like the snapping of chains. It rolled across the room as relatives rose from their seats, clapping not for spectacle, but for vindication. News traveled faster than the smoke of a fire. Within hours, the whispers left the funeral home and spread into the streets, into the neighborhood, and then into the city. By the next morning, headlines gleamed across social media and in the papers. Son and daughter-in-law disinherited after humiliating widow at husband's funeral. Matriarch Bellezza Hall stuns family with $51.00 M-will. Cruelty exposed. The public devoured the story, outrage swelling like a tide. Strangers I had never met filled the internet with words of solidarity. Justice at last. No mother deserves this. She is stronger than all of them combined. Hashtags bloomed, carrying my name further than I ever imagined possible. Meanwhile, Owen's business partners began withdrawing quietly, unwilling to be associated with a man now branded as greedy, unfilial, and dishonorable. Clients canceled deals, friends stopped answering calls, his phone lit up not with opportunities, but with demands, debts, accusations. Victoria fared no better. Those emails dripping with venom surfaced in the press, stripped bare of all context but their truth. The women who once entertained her at charity luncheons now deleted her from guest lists. The whispers followed her everywhere, at the grocery store, at her salon, even walking down the street. She became a symbol not of wealth, but of cruelty. And I walked out of that room not in shame but in power. For the first time in decades, I did not feel like a shadow lurking behind my own family's name. I felt like Bellezza Hall, the woman who had once given up her career for her son, the woman who had endured silence for love, the woman who had finally chosen truth over submission. Victoria's words echoed in my mind, "You'll die alone." But as I stepped into the cool night air, I realized something. Dying alone is not the tragedy. Living surrounded by vipers, by those who would tear the flesh from your bones for $1, that is the true loneliness. And I had freed myself from it. The world saw the truth now, and so did I. The downfall of Owen and Victoria came swiftly, like a tree rotten at its roots, finally collapsing under its own weight. The mansion that Owen had so proudly claimed as his, boasting of renovations, flaunting it to his colleagues, was seized by the bank when the truth of his debts surfaced. He and Victoria, once dressed in the finest clothes and surrounded by admirers, found themselves escorted out with nothing more than suitcases and the clothes on their backs. Neighbors who once nodded politely now closed their doors, whispering behind curtains. Their empire, built on arrogance and deceit, dissolved into ash. The company Owen had inherited in name, but never in vision, crumbled next. Investigations revealed years of financial mismanagement, hidden debts, and reckless speculation. Investors pulled out, stockholders demanded answers, and soon his name was smeared across the business pages. From heir to ruin, Owen Hall exploded. The man who once sneered at his mother for being irrelevant now found himself shunned, irrelevant, in every circle he once craved. Victoria fared no better. Her words, ugly, venomous words about selling her mother-in-law's organs, were immortalized in print, shared across networks, replayed in commentary after commentary. She became a pariah, her face recognized for cruelty rather than beauty. Even those she once charmed at luncheons and society events now turned their backs, ashamed to have ever called her a friend. But as their world fell, mine quietly blossomed again. Invitations began arriving, first in letters, then in calls. Women's engineering groups, universities, and advocacy foundations all wanted me to speak. "Tell us your story," they said. "Show us the strength that lived in the silence." Months after the funeral, I stood before a hall filled with young women, their notebooks open, their eyes alight. It was the annual Silent Women Engineers Conference, a gathering to honor those who had been written out of history. My name was called, and I walked slowly to the podium. Behind me, projected larger than life, was an image I had nearly forgotten, myself in my 20s, standing at a chalkboard, scrawling equations late into the night while colleagues looked on. The caption beneath read, "Bellezza Hall, the hidden hand behind automation advances, 1974. For a moment, my breath caught. All the years of being told I was invisible, irrelevant, a burden, swept away by that single photograph restored to its rightful place. I spoke that day not of bitterness, but of truth. They told me my work did not matter because my name was not on the paper. They told me my silence was expected, my sacrifice ordinary. But I tell you, there is nothing ordinary about building something that lasts, and there is nothing silent about the truth once it rises. When I finished, the applause thundered through the hall. For the first time in decades, I felt not erased, but written back into the story. The recognition grew. The National Institute of Engineering commissioned a portrait of me for their Hall of Legacy. I stood before it at the unveiling, watching my younger self immortalized in oil, scarf around my shoulders, chalk still in hand. Beneath it, carved into stone, were the words, "She was silenced, she endured, she built, and she remains." Jaden worked tirelessly alongside me, though he insisted on staying in the background. He had taken the inheritance left to him and used it not for himself, but to build the Hall Foundation for Future Engineers, a scholarship program for women and underrepresented students in science. "Your legacy should be a doorway," he told me, "not a monument." And so, the doorway opened. Yet the sweetest moment came not from the stage, nor the headlines, but from a small envelope slipped under my door one spring morning. The handwriting was clumsy, childlike, but instantly recognizable. It was Elise, my granddaughter, Owen's daughter. Inside was a folded note, written in pencil. "Grandma, your scarf made me feel brave, thank you." I remembered that morning at the funeral, when she had blushed as I tied it around her. My scarf had lived on her shoulders, but also in her heart. I pressed the paper to my chest, tears welling but not from sorrow, from something gentler, something healing. I framed that letter and hung it above my desk, where the morning sun could touch it each day. It was proof that not all was lost, that even in poisoned soil, a single flower could grow. As I looked at that note, I thought of Victoria's jeers, Owen's cold dismissals, the years of silence I endured, and I smiled, because while they had stripped me of family and name, they could not take from me the truth, nor the love that still lingered in small, unexpected places. And so I say this, not in anger, but in triumph. They once called me invisible, but in the end, it was they who disappeared from the legacy. I remain. I endured, and I have written the story they tried to erase. For the first time, I was not just surviving, I was living. When I look back now, I do not see only the cruelty of my son or the venom of my daughter-in-law. I see the quiet power of truth finally stepping into the light. They tried to sell everything, even my dignity, but in the end, it was their own names that were sold cheaply, cast out and forgotten. I was told I would die invisible, that no one would remember me. But today my work hangs in the halls of the nation. My story is told in classrooms, and my granddaughter wears my scarf with pride. The ones who called me worthless are the ones erased. I remain, and if you have ever been silenced, pushed aside, or treated like a burden, remember this: wisdom does not expire, and the truth will always outlast the lie. This was my true story. There are many more like it, waiting to be told. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories so that every quiet woman finally has her voice heard, and so no one, no matter how forgotten, can ever be written out of history again.